I grew up with legends and fables, but they weren't the normal kinds of legends you would find in a storybook. No. Instead, my legends were told in the pages of a photo album with faces I almost recognized, who I were told were the faces of my mom and dad, my amma and tati. Each picture told a story, and my favorite story, the one that I would tell myself over and over, was of the moment when my mom and dad first arrived together in this country for the very first time. I would combine all the details I had heard and all the photos I had seen of that moment into a kind of legend. The legend of my parents. Allow me to set the scene. My parents first met playing tennis together when they were 13 in Sri Lanka. And when my dad got old enough, he was able to go off to America, the land of opportunity. Separated by thousands of miles of ocean, my parents wrote letters to each other back and forth, dreaming of when they could finally look each other in the eyes again. Until one fateful day in 1999, when my mom was able to enter the country for the very first time. That was the moment. As my mom and dad embraced for the first time in years, they set their sights on the great American dream, and then a few years later had the best time of their lives when their second child, me, was born. That was the story, or at least that was the story I told myself. You see, my parents were the heroes of a legend of my own creation and control. And I cherish that legend because of how much it filled me with a sense of hope and pride, but like a memory that slowly degrades every single time you try and remember it. Every time I told myself that story, it got happier and happier and simpler until it stopped becoming about a real moment. It became indistinguishable from fiction because it was perfect. And my parents' lives weren't perfect, and that moment especially was not perfect. And as much as that moment gave me satisfaction, a kind of comfortable ignorance, it wasn't really real. I wanted to know, really, what that moment was. Not what I wanted it to be, not what years of reiterating had turned it into. No. I wanted to know what it was. One moment could mean so much to me. How could I leave it be? How could I leave it alone? I couldn't let it be a myth because it was real. It's still real. My parents still wake up every morning wanting to know what they can do for their kids now that they're in this country, even before those kids even existed. So what could I do? Well, I decided to take the first step by asking my parents the real story of what happened in their one fateful moment. My parents first met playing tennis together when they were 13 in Sri Lanka, but you know that part. And when my dad got old enough, he had to go to America in order to help pay off his student loans. But my mom, she did not want to go to America. My mom's lifelong dream was to be a professor of surgery, and America would mean leaving all of that behind. Sri Lanka had her siblings, it had her mom's cooking, it had a language she could speak without hesitation, and America had none of that. And despite all of that, at only 27, she made arguably the hardest choice of her life by deciding to join my dad in America, and not to buy some fantasy of American living. She did it out of love for my dad. My mom chose my dad, not America. And when it came to that moment in 1999, when my mom and dad first embraced for the first time in years, unbeknownst to me, that was only the beginning of their story. New York's bitter winters were an absolute culture shock for my parents. And while my dad worked, my mom would spend countless sleepless nights combing through medical textbooks. And in order to keep my mom in medical school, my parents had to limit their weekly grocery budget to $25. Now, in the months before my mom's USMLE exam, my parents put everything they had into getting her prepared. Passing this medical board licensing exam was required to even qualify for residency, but even if she did pass with a low score, it would take 7 years before she could take it again, long after her visitor's visa would expire. Everything they had sacrificed on the line, my mom studied over 10 hours a day, with my dad helping her every step of the way. My parents packed 4 years of learning in just those 2 months. And by the end of it, there was nothing she wasn't ready for. But the day my mom goes to take her final exam, the board checks her marriage certificate, sees it's in Sinhalese, and the translation was rejected. In a second, all their hard work, all their sacrifices, and that one very special moment collapsed into meaninglessness. Now look, I did promise a happy ending, so here it is, okay? After a year of effort and contact with the foreign ministry, my mom was able to take and pass her final exam with flying colors, but all of a sudden, that moment and her history are nothing like my legend, because it talks about a real moment, a messy, unsatisfying moment. But that moment means so much more to me now, because I know how hard it was for them to keep that moment real. I know how hard they fought to keep that moment alive. I could have allowed that moment to be as it was, nothing more than a moment, nothing more than a dot on the line of my past. But I decided to learn from it, and not just learn from it, learn of it, learn what it really was. And it was horrifying. Choosing reality over the stories we tell ourselves is a Pandora's box that you cannot unclose. But all those fears seemed to vanish when I saw how their faces lit up. They didn't have a way to say it, but no one wants their history to be forgotten. If we allow the foggy memories of the moments in our past drift off into obscurity, used only to keep us focused with where we are now, we'll never know why those moments were worth remembering at all. We'll never know what the people in our past were fighting for in the first place. Up until this point, my parents' history, it had been myth, it had been fable, it had been legend. Until I decided to make a change. I decided to go after that moment. The most important moments of our lives may be long lost to the past, but all anyone has to do is go looking for them. Thank you so much for coming out. I appreciate all of you.